Hello Internet, welcome to the Economy Q&A brought to you by Press Association and Full Fact. Full Fact is the UK's independent fact-checking charity. We've been busy fact-checking the election. You can see all of that work at fullfact.org. Today we're answering your questions on the economy. When I say we, I mean the Institute for Fiscal Studies who are joining me today. Be sure to send us your questions, so click comment below, send it in. We're taking questions on the economy, so anything that you want answered. And then remember to click share so your friends and family get a chance to ask their question too before the election. I'm Mivan from Full Fact, and I'm joined by Helen Miller and Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the Institute for can you tell us a little bit about yourselves and the Institute for Fiscal Studies? What are fiscal studies?
Well, fiscal studies, in the way that we take it, means essentially studying everything the government does with your money, spending it, taxing it, and what it means for how well off people are, how much they're earning, how that's changing, what's happening to the income distribution, what we're doing with pensions and welfare, all of those sorts of things. So how well off people are and what the government does and how it impacts on you. And we do that entirely by looking at data. So we're always data driven. We're not sort of theory driven. We're not driven by just thinking. It's all based on evidence and data and analysing it.
Great, sounds good. It sounds like you grapple with a lot of the big questions.
We do our best.
So a question that we got in earlier is, what is a budget deficit, and are debt and deficit the same thing?
Well, the budget deficit is just the difference between the amount of money the government gets in from taxes mostly and how much it spends. And at the moment, it spends quite a lot more than it gets in taxes. So we've got a deficit of about £60 billion each year, which is quite a lot less than it was immediately after the crisis. But it's more than it's been on average. Debt is different. Debt is the accumulated amount of deficits that we built up over time. So we've got a deficit of about 60 billion, but we've got a debt of about 1.175 trillion pounds. So a very, very big number. So
what's that compared to other countries? Because a number like 1.3 trillion sounds big, but how big is it?
Well, our deficit, the amount we're borrowing every year, is bigger than nearly all countries. It's advanced countries. Right. It's pretty big still, even though it's come down a lot. Yeah. Our debt is quite big, but there are quite a lot of other particularly big countries which have slightly bigger debts than that. But to put it in perspective, our debt now is bigger than it's been at any time since the mid-1960s. Okay,
so another question we've got in is, what is GDP? How do you measure it? Do we want it to be high?
So GDP is just the way we try to measure the size of the economy. So you can imagine that what economists are trying to do is measure all the production that happens, so all the activity that people and companies are doing, measure that and say, how much would we do this year? So bigger is better, because we'd like a bigger economy, so that we have more income, we're wealthier. Yeah, it's just a measure of the size of the economy.
So how does that link to inflation?
So inflation is a measure of how prices are changing over time. So I think you go to the supermarket, you buy bread and milk, but over time those prices change. So what inflation is doing is saying, by how much are those prices changing? So at the moment, inflation for most household goods is running at about 1.8%. So that means that on average, prices are now 1.8% higher than they were last year. And that basically matters because it affects how far the pound in your pocket goes, so how much you can buy with your income.
Okay, just going to take a quick moment to just say, be sure to ask us your questions. We're taking them live, and we'll try and answer as many as we can in the half-hour slot that we have. So debt deficit, GDP, inflation. Can you give us a little bit of a history lesson? You already have done, but what has happened to our economy in the past 10 years?
Well, if you look at the economy as a whole, it hasn't done very well in the last 10 years. We had a terrible crisis in 2008 and 2009, and the size of the economy shrank really quite a lot. I mean, historically more than it's ever shrunk in a recession, actually, certainly since the last war. By about 8% over those couple of years. And the real problem has been that it hasn't grown very much since then. So usually when you go into recession, you have a terrible couple of years and then the economy kind of starts pulling away again. But this time round, actually, if you look at national income per person, so you take GDP that Helen was describing and divide it by the number of people, it's barely any bigger now than it was in 2008. So that's 9 years without a growth in this national income per person, and that's dreadful. We really haven't experienced anything like that in a century, and probably longer, and that's what underlies a lot of the issues that we're seeing. So earnings haven't grown as a result of that, and indeed earnings are actually, if anything, below where they were in 2008. Living standards have barely grown as a result of that. So all of this really stems from that big financial crisis back in 2008 and 2009 and the very slow recovery we've had since then.
So we've got a question in from Emma which says, so has the deficit actually been reduced like this government claim?
The deficit's come down a lot. I mean, the deficit really expanded dramatically following the recession, and it's come down by about 2/3. And it's come down partly because there's been a little bit of growth, but significantly because the government has really pulled spending back over those years. So, as I say, the deficit is still bigger than it's been on average since the last war, but it's only about 1/3 the size it was back in 2010.
So we've had another question in which says, why has the national debt risen to 1.8 trillion, like you said, in spite of austerity? And what has all this extra borrowed money been spent on?
Well, it's down to this issue about the direction of the deficit and the debt. So the deficit has come down, but we're still borrowing a lot every year. So we're borrowing less than we were, but we're still borrowing quite a lot. And so the debt is piling up, and it's piling up, and it's getting towards the way we normally like to think about it as knocking on for 90% of national income, and that's getting to quite high levels. What's the money been spent on? Well, it's been spent on all of the things that you would normally expect money spent on. The biggest chunks of it are pensions and health. They're easily the two biggest chunks of what we spend money on, and actually they're two things that we spend more on now than we did back in 2008. A lot of other things, certainly relative to the size of the economy, we're spending less on. So we're spending less on things like police and justice and some aspects of education. But what we're doing over time is more and more of what we're spending on health and pensions and actually long-term care as the population gets older.
So we are definitely spending more money on health and, what was the other thing, sorry?
Pensions.
Pensions. But does that mean that we're getting more for our money for those things? Does that mean we're actually improving healthcare? And does that mean that pensions are better now? Which might be too big a question to answer, but I just wondered what you thought.
Well, state pensions are higher now than they were back in 2010. It's one of the very few areas that the coalition government and the Conservative government are completely protected, and they've raised those pensions faster than inflation, actually faster than earnings over that period. The thing about health is that while spending on it has grown, it's grown much more slowly than ever it has done in the past, because our demand for healthcare increases over time, partly because we're getting older over time, as a population, I mean, obviously individually we are, and partly because the cost of providing healthcare tends to go up. So whilst we're spending more on health, we're spending probably less than we need in order to keep up with the demand.
So when do you predict that our borrowing will be reduced?
Well, our borrowing already is reduced, as we were saying, quite a lot relative to 2010.
Yeah.
Now,
but when will it go away entirely?
Well, that depends on a lot of things. And one thing it obviously depends on is who wins the election. So the Conservatives have got a very different set of policies to the Labour Party. They actually want to bring borrowing down to zero through the 2020s, and that's why under the Conservatives we'd have quite a lot more spending cuts. Whereas Labour have said, actually, we're quite happy to borrow quite a lot, actually. And so they wouldn't aim to get it down to zero. In fact, they wouldn't aim to get it down much below where it is at the moment. And whoever wins, the other thing that's going to really matter is how well the economy goes, what happens post-Brexit and all those sorts of things. But there's big choices there between Labour and Conservatives. Labour saying, look, borrowing, we're quite happy to borrow really quite a lot. Conservatives, in the end, we actually don't want to be borrowing anything.
So what would be the knock-on consequences of those two parts?
Well, the knock-on consequences from the Conservatives' point of view, of course, is that you can't get borrowing down to zero without cutting spending or increasing taxes. And they're clearly saying that it's on the spending side they want to continue squeezing, though actually taxes will rise under the Conservatives as well. For Labour, there's obviously an awful lot more spending and an awful lot more taxing that they're intending to do. The question, though, is because they're also doing a lot more borrowing, is there a long-term problem associated with the scale of that borrowing if that means that the debt doesn't, in the end, start coming down?
So on taxes, both of them include taxes, but which taxes raise the most money?
So we get the majority of our taxes, tax revenues from three big taxes, which are income tax, national insurance contributions, which you can just think of as another type of income tax, and VAT. So those taxes bring in about 2/3 of our revenue. We then get another decent sized chunk from corporation tax, some from taxes on properties and taxes on fuel, and then a whole host of other small taxes. But most of it comes from taxes on income or consumption.
Okay, what about the land value tax? I've
So
heard a lot about it.
yeah, there's
Do we
been
have to
lots of
sell our
discussion
gardens?
about land value tax and about garden taxes.
Yes.
So the idea of a land value tax, so we currently have two taxes on property. So one is council tax, which people will be familiar with. It's basically the tax you pay to live in your home. The other is business rates, which you can think of as the equivalent for business properties. A land value tax would be an idea to replace those taxes with a different type of tax that says rather than value the whole property, so the land and the building on it, you would just value the land underlying it. The idea behind that is to say we don't want to stop people from building on the land. If you build a very nice business building, your tax rate goes up, and we don't think that's a very good feature. So the idea of a land value tax would be to just use a tax base based on the value. The discussion recently is about this garden tax. Has been the idea that maybe we'll move council tax to a land value tax and we'll be taxing gardens. I think that's misleading because council tax is currently based on the whole value of your property, including your garden. But the council tax system is actually ridiculously out of date, and we probably should do something about it. So it's currently based on the values of properties in 1991. Just think about how much has changed since 1991. That's got to be silly. And it's kind of bizarre in the sense that it's levied as a high portion of value for low value properties than for high value properties. So we probably should look at the council tax system, and we'd have a choice about whether we want to sort of update that system, bring property values up in line with what they currently are, and maybe make it proportional to value, so to make it fairer. Or we could do a different route and do a land value tax, and that would be a bit of a different type of solution. But it's basically getting at it's an idea for how you tax property effectively.
The other thing that's worth saying is that the bit of land that currently doesn't get taxed at all is the big bits of land. So if you've got 10,000 acres of farmland or something, there's no tax on that, no business rates, no council tax, nothing. And actually, a land value tax presumably would start to get at that.
So how much money would it potentially raise? Do we know?
Any amount that you wanted, depending on what rate you set it at. Now, obviously, there's a limit on that, and actually, we have add council tax and business rates together, and relative to a lot of countries, it's already relatively high here. You could certainly get some more, and you could particularly get some more from expensive houses and from this land, agricultural land and estates that are not currently taxed.
So you also mentioned corporation tax. Could you explain a little bit what that is and how ours compares to other countries?
Sure. So corporation tax is the tax that businesses pay on their profits, and they pay it on profits that are generated in the UK. So that's not just about UK sales, it's about how much activity, how much value was produced in the UK, how much profit did that create, and that gets taxed. So there'll be some companies that actually sell a lot of stuff here, but actually that the underlying price, think of a phone in your pocket. So you're buying the phone here, but a lot of that will have been produced in other countries, both the actual physical hardware of it and the software, the things that make it cool and make the nice interface. A lot of that was done abroad. So we're not taxing all of the profits from the sales of that phone, we're just taxing the activities that were done in the UK. So currently we have a rate of 19%. That's kind of low by international standards, so most other a lot of countries have higher rates. But that's actually one of the areas where the parties are offering very different things. So under the Conservatives, they'd like to see that rate cut further to 17%. The Labour Party would like to reverse a lot of the cuts that we've seen in recent years and move the main rate back up to 26%. So 26% would still be lower than most of our kind of big international competitors like the US, France, Germany, but we would be less competitive than other countries in Europe. And higher rates make the UK a less attractive place to do investment.
We've had a question in from Michael that says, if corporations have their taxes raised, will they look elsewhere? If so, what countries in Europe have a lower rate of corporation tax?
So I think it's worth saying there is that corporation tax clearly isn't the only factor that affects where firms want to decide to locate. They're also going to look at the infrastructure you have in a country and how good your skilled workforce is and how close you are to the market and lots of other factors. So corporation, it's not like everyone goes and crams into the lowest corporation tax country. But tax is a factor that matters because if you put your activity there and you get a lower tax rate, that's more attractive for you to do investment. So if we had higher taxes, I think, yes, it would make us a less attractive location. it's a bit hard to look just at headline rates. So like Ireland, for example, has a lower headline rate. They have 12.5%, so they're pretty attractive. But there's also important features of the tax base. It's not just about the headline rate. And some other European countries also offer particularly attractive tax bases that make them good destinations for investment. So higher tax rates would make us less attractive for investment.
Okay, so say we did increase corporation tax. Who would feel that tax? Would it be the companies themselves? Would it be the employees? Would it be the consumers? Would prices go up? How does that play out?
Yeah, so the important point to realise there is that ultimately all taxes, every single one of them, have to be paid by people. The interesting question is always, which you're getting at, I think, is which people?
Yeah.
So in the first instance, I think that you'd think that higher corporation tax means lower corporate profits. That's instantly going to affect shareholders because they're the ones that have the claim on those profits. Mm-hmm. And that's not just rich people who own shares directly, although it's them too. It's also people who hold private pensions. So indirectly, all of us, I suspect, are shareholders through our pension funds. So shareholders feel it. The thing that economists worry most about, actually, though, is how those taxes can be passed on to consumers or to workers. So we just discussed how corporation tax can lower investment. Mm-hmm. But if that happens, lower investment in the UK means that we have less productive workers and fewer jobs. So less productive workers, fewer jobs, lower wages. And that's a way in which corporation tax can end up being paid by workers. You also mentioned prices. Companies can also respond to higher corporation tax by increasing their prices. Now, which of those groups actually end up paying is going to vary over time and across countries, mm-hmm. depending on lots of different factors. But one of those three groups has to be paying. It's probably more shareholders in the short run, and it's probably more workers in the sort of medium to long run.
Okay, just going to quickly talk to you guys again. If you have a question for us, be sure to send it in. Just click comment below. We're going through all of them and trying to answer as many as we can in the 30 minutes that we have. Although it's not 30 minutes anymore. Back to the questions. Renationalisation. Is it financially possible for Labour to renationalise the railways?
Short answer is yes. Okay. Most of the value of railways is already nationalised because the track through Network Rail is now nationalised, and that's actually got a very large amount of debt associated with it. So in a sense, we've already done the difficult bit. Okay. When it comes to the running of the railways, they're all run by what are called franchises. So train companies bid for that, and some of them actually pay the government money for the right to run those schemes, and some actually get paid by the government because they're unprofitable. And if you just, as the franchises come up for renewal, if you just brought them back into the public sector, the cost would be the how much less you're getting, you're being paid for the right to do it. The real question here is there any reason to believe that either the state or private companies are better at running the railways, and how much money you put in? Because we already put a lot of public money into the railways, and actually, if you look over the last 20 years, usage of the railways has grown enormously since they came into the private sector. But that's not necessarily because they're in the private sector. That's because demand in various ways has grown as well. So the issue is how are they best going to be run?
Is there any evidence elsewhere about who is better at running these kinds of services?
It often depends on the market structure. Is there some competition there? It really depends on how much money is going in, probably more than the ownership. But those of us who are old enough can remember the railways before privatisation, and they weren't great.
Okay, we have a question about minimum wage. So the Conservatives brought in a national living wage, which isn't the same thing as the living wage, which is a voluntary thing that companies can sign up for, right?
Right, that's, yes, so you've put the confusion perfectly. So various organisations have been campaigning for a long time for what they call a living wage, which is supposed to be an amount which is enough to live on. Mm-hmm. Though, of course, the amount you need to live on depends a lot depending on your housing costs, or whether you've got children to look after, or whether you're living at home with your parents or what have you. I need a lot more to live on now that I've got 4 children than I did before I had 4 children. But the national living wage that the Conservatives brought in is actually just an increase in the minimum wage. So okay. The minimum wage we've had a minimum wage in the UK since 1999. Mm-hmm. It has traditionally been set.
Did we really not have one before 1999?
During the 1990s, we didn't have one at all. In the period from 1909 until 1993, we had things called various different things, but wages councils at the end, which set minima in particular industries like agriculture and garment industry and so on at different rates. There was one for fancy ostrich feather makers or something, I think, in the 1930s. But it wasn't a national minimum wage, and it didn't cover everyone, and that was got rid of in 1994, I think it was.
Okay.
Minimum wage came in 1999. Until 2014 or so, covered about one worker in 20, mostly part-time workers and overwhelmingly women. But only about one worker in 20. Now and it was set by this thing called the Low Pay Commission, whose job was to say, what minimum wage can we pay, which we're pretty confident isn't going to result in fewer people having jobs, because of course if you force companies to pay more and more and more, then they may end up reducing the number of people they employ. Now, George Osborne decided that was too conservative with a small c, and decided he wanted actually to try out a higher level of the minimum wage, which is called the National Living Wage, which goes to people over the age of 25, and that's heading towards £9 an hour by 2020. And by then we expect it to be affecting not one worker in 20, but more like one worker in 8. So it's a really, really big change from one worker in 20 to one worker in 8 over the age of 25. Now the Labour Party are outbidding. So they say not £9 an hour, let's have £10 an hour, and not £10 an hour just for the over 25s, but £10 an hour for everyone over the age of 18. And that's radically different. Right. So that means that nearly 2/3 of people under the age of 25 would actually have their pay set from Whitehall at £10 an hour. So every 18-year-old would have to earn £10 an hour. That's £20,000 a year full-time. That's quite risky, actually, setting the wages of a majority of 18 to 24-year-olds at that kind of level.
So we've got a question in from Tom that says, why have wages not risen in line with inflation?
Well, that's a very good question.
Is it true?
Since 2008, it is true, actually. Okay. So wages fell up till about 2013 relative to inflation quite a lot. They were picking up over the 2014, 2015, 2016 period. But the bad news is that since the Brexit referendum, the value of the pound has gone down. That makes imports into the UK more expensive, so inflation has gone up, and wages haven't risen in line any further. So wages have stopped rising again. They were beginning to rise, but they've stopped again. So average wages now, sadly, are still below where they were in 2008. And the underlying reason for that is productivity hasn't grown. In other words, the amount that we produce with every hour we work doesn't appear to be rising. And why that is, well, that's a very big, long question that I'm not going to try and answer right now.
So we've got 5 minutes left, so we're going to try and zoom through some of our questions. Are any of the parties going to help with falling wages and living standards? We've kind of already touched on that a little bit, but can you tell us a bit more about the parties now?
What do we add to that? I mean, I guess maybe one thing worth saying is that the Conservatives didn't have very many policies in their manifestos, but there's already actually quite a large cut to benefits due to be coming in. Now, the Labour Party would reverse some of those, but not most of them. So under both the Conservative and the Labour Party, there are cuts to some of the benefits for working age families with children that are due to come in, and that will obviously affect the living standards of some of those families.
I think what's quite depressing about both the manifestos of the big parties is that I've described the difficult economic situation we're in and the risk that we face going forward. You wouldn't know that that was a problem if you looked at their manifestos. They're not really trying to address the underlying economic issues.
So, at Full Fact, we've been asked quite a lot whether the manifestos have been costed well, if a certain party is thought about that more than any other. Do you guys have anything you could add to that at all?
Well, the Conservatives haven't really said much in their manifesto. So, in a sense, there wasn't much to cost. I mean, genuinely, there wasn't much to cost in there. I think what I could make out their strategy has been to say, we'll carry on essentially as we are, but we're going to leave ourselves the freedom to raise taxes, which I suspect they would. And we're really not going to tell you very much about what we're going to do on the spending side. Labour Party has got some very, very big spending commitments and some very, very big tax commitments. The spending commitments, from what one can tell, look like they're properly costed, they come to £75 billion a year. And just to be clear, £75 billion a year is a very, very, very big number. That's like 10% increase in the amount that we spend. But as Helen said, that doesn't include extra money for undoing the welfare cuts. It doesn't include actually very much for the NHS, so maybe they want to spend more than that. On the tax side, they've provided a set of numbers which add up to £50 billion. The trouble is they don't really. You couldn't get £50 billion from the tax rises that they've suggested. What they're talking about is getting the UK state closer to actually the average size of spending in the rest of Europe, which is absolutely economically sensible and reasonable thing to do. But if you're going to do that, you need to raise taxes properly. And by properly, I mean need to raise taxes on most people, whether that be through income tax or VAT or national insurance contributions. You cannot do it in the way that they're describing, which is entirely by raising corporate taxes and taxes on the rich. That's just not doable.
Okay, so 2 quick questions to end off. There's been some recent criticism of the IFS as being an institution that doesn't do macroeconomics. Could you first of all tell us what macroeconomics are? And what are the implications of this criticism, and how should we read IFS's findings about the election manifestos in the general election, given the extensive coverage that the IFS has got about this?
Well, I take macroeconomics to be, I think in most people's minds, forecasts about what's going to happen to unemployment and the size of the economy and so on going forward. And we don't tend to make forecasts of that, partly because it's a bit of a mug's game, it's very difficult to do. And as I said right at the beginning, everything we do is based on very careful analysis of actual data. Now, does that matter for what we're saying? Well, we thought a year ago in the run-up to the Brexit referendum it did, because you could say with almost complete certainty that the UK out of the single market would be worse off than the UK in the single market. I mean, there really isn't much doubt about that. If you're looking at the 2 parties' manifestos now, though, there's a lot of doubt. The Conservatives want to do some things which would make us worse off, I'm afraid, cutting immigration being one of them, continuing to austerity is like to be another. The Labour Party wants to do some things which might actually grow the economy, so a big increase in investment spending, for example, but they also want to do things which would have the opposite effect. Big increases in corporate tax, big increases in labour regulation, which, in 5 years' time, which would give us the bigger economy? I don't know, and anyone who tells you they know is either, I would disagree with them that they knew. Let's put it that way.
And finally, are there any questions that you don't see anybody asking, but you would like people to be asking more?
Blimey. I think it partly comes to the question you asked earlier about, what are the parties saying about the economy and what they would do to make things better? And I can't remember an election where we've had less discussion about the economy, where we've had less discussion about the impact of a higher or lower amount of borrowing. We've had less discussion about the impact of minimum wages and so on. We've got 2 manifestos out there which are really radically different and will have radically different impacts. And yet, actually, we haven't, I think, been told by either the parties or the people questioning them quite how different they are and quite what those impacts are likely to be.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering our questions. And if we haven't answered your question, then we will be replying in the comments with links to fact checks or briefings or explainers. Hopefully we'll get through as many of them as we can. Join us in about 5 minutes for another Q&A, but this time on health. And I'll be joined by 2 experts from the Nuffield Trust. Thanks very much.